Senate Armed Services Committee meets this morning to receive testimony on U.S. policy and strategy in Europe. I'd like to welcome our distinguished witnesses this morning. General Philip Breedlove, who was relieved of his obligation to appear before this committee when he retired last year, yet has graciously agreed to submit himself before us once again. I have no doubt he will soon regret that decision and will wish for a speedy return to Georgia Tech, where he is distinguished professor at the Sam Nunn School of International Affairs. We're also pleased to be joined by Ambassador Williams Burns, an old friend of this committee and of America, who is the president of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and Ambassador Alexander Vershbow, who is a distinguished fellow at the Atlantic Council's Brent Scowcroft Center on International Security. All three of these gentlemen combined have many, many decades of service to this country, and we are grateful they would come and join us this morning. Since the end of the Cold War, American policy and strategy in Europe have been guided by the idea that Russia was, at least might become, a reliable security partner. To varying degrees, each of our last three presidents pursued a partnership with Russia on these terms, and each time high hopes ended in disappointment, not for lack of good faith or effort on the American side, but because of the simple fact that Vladimir Putin has no interest in such a partnership. He believes achieving his goal of restoring Russia as a great power means diminishing American power as well as the values and institutions it sustains and defends. Unfortunately, we as a country were slow to recognize that fact. Russia invaded Georgia and Ukraine, annexed Crimea, repeatedly threatened our NATO allies, violated the INF Treaty, rapidly modernized its military, executed a major military buildup along its western border, and interfered in American elections, all before policymakers on both sides of the aisle truly began to come to terms not only with the reality of Vladimir Putin's neo-imperial ambitions, but also with the heavy price we have paid for a policy General Breedlove once described as, quote, hugging the bear. Until the end of the Cold War, there were 250,000 U.S. forces stationed permanently in West Germany alone. Today, we have just a quarter of that number on the entire European continent. This drastic reduction was not merely the product of a post-Cold War peace dividend. Indeed, as recently as the 2 years before Russia invaded Ukraine, the United States withdrew 2 brigade combat teams from Europe. As a result, while Russian tanks rolled into Crimea in 2014, the United States had 0 tanks permanently stationed in Europe. Likewise, we let American intelligence on Russia's tactical and operational capabilities languish, weakening our ability to quickly detect Russia's large military movements and effectively attribute its, quote, hybrid warfare tactics. And we unilaterally disengaged from the information fight, allowing Putin's propaganda machine an army of trolls and hackers to wage a war on truth with alarming success. The bottom line is that 3 years after the invasion of Ukraine and annexation of Crimea, the United States has yet to heed the wake-up call. We still have not adjusted to the scope, scale, and severity of the new strategic reality we face in Europe, and we continue to lack coherent policy and strategy to deter conflict and prevent aggression in Europe, while confronting a revisionist Russia that is hostile to our interests and our values. The good news is we have begun to fix the damage done by years of false assumptions and misguided policy with the European Deterrence Initiative. But that is just a first step. The new administration has an opportunity to turn the page and design a new policy and strategy in Europe backed by all elements of American power and decisive political will. Each of our witnesses has deep experience in the formulation and execution of national security strategy, and I hope they can begin to describe the basic pillars and underlying principles of such a policy and strategy. Some of the features of a new approach in Europe are already clear: enhancing forward presence of U.S. military forces, increasing investments in capabilities necessary to counter Russia's advanced anti-access area denial threat, following through on modernization of our nuclear triad, devising gray zone strategy for competition below the threshold of major conflict in domains such as cyber and unconventional warfare, providing defensive lethal assistance to Ukraine, and working together with allies and partners to arm ourselves to resist Russia's war on truth, counter Russian disinformation, and strengthen the resiliency of our societies and institutions. What's also clear is that no U.S. policy or strategy in Europe can be successful without our NATO allies. As Chancellor Merkel reminded us years ago, the Freedom Bell hangs in Berlin. It was a gift from the American people modeled after our own Liberty Bell. It rang on the day of German reunification, but it also rang after the September 11th attack. 16 German citizens died when the towers fell that day. When our NATO allies invoked Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty for the first time in history, in response to those attacks, German troops went to fight side by side with American troops in Afghanistan. 54 of them have given their lives, and nearly 1,000 are still serving there today. We must never forget or diminish the price our allies have paid in blood fighting alongside America. I thank our witnesses for their testimony this morning. Senator Reid.